Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the third installment of the International Conference Restart 21, coming to you live from the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom in Berlin. I'm Melinda Crane, and it's great to have you with us. As our film indicated, the purpose of this four-part conference is to restart discussion about how liberal values can guide Europe and other international actors in solving pressing challenges that will shape the post-pandemic future. Because liberal principles such as freedom and fairness, opportunity and access, multilateralism and cooperation will be more important now than ever. Science and education are topics at the very heart of liberalism, which is why they're the focus of this session of our conference. The pandemic has served as a crucial reminder of the importance of cooperation in both fields, not only because it was research collaboration that facilitated the development of vaccines, but also because lockdowns and quarantines interrupted educational exchange programs with grave consequences for participants. However, it is by no means COVID-19 alone that has dealt a blow to international cooperation in the field of science and academics. The end of the Erasmus Plus program in Britain will limit educational opportunities for young Europeans. And meanwhile, some Western universities face a dilemma in dealing with Chinese Confucius Institutes dependent on the Chinese Communist Party. So our panel aims to ask whether and how we can put international educational cooperation on a new footing. Beyond Brexit and Corona, the future of international education cooperation, that's our topic, and we have a great, outstanding roster of experts to talk about it. Before I introduce them, just a very quick word on how you can participate, dear ladies and gentlemen, because we're eager to hear your comments and questions. Please share these via the chat, the Q&A function on our live stream, and I'll pass the selection on to our panelists a little bit later on in the discussion. And we also invite you to participate in audience polls. And in fact, I'd like to conduct such a poll right now as input for our first round of discussion. UN Secretary General Guterres said at the beginning of this year that the disruption brought on by COVID-19 is an opportunity to reimagine and revitalize education. And he called on all of us to make the most of that opportunity in order to avoid a lost generation. So here's our question. To reimagine educational cooperation in the wake of the pandemic and Brexit, we should prioritize, and then we have multiple choice selection for you, ladies and gentlemen, EdTech and digital tools, access for vulnerable groups and regions, new partnerships and alliances amongst government institutions and public universities, new partnerships and alliances involving the private sector, and finally, enhanced mobility for students and researchers, in particular from non-European countries. And I'm sure some amongst you would love to check all those boxes, but in fact, we're asking you to prioritize and select one from amongst those options. And we'll come back in just a moment to take a look at the results. First, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers, beginning with Bettina Stark-Watzinger, who's with me here live in the studio as a wonderful exception in these virtual times. She's a member of the Bundestag and chief whip of the Free Democrats Party's parliamentary group, as well as chairwoman of the party's chapter from the federal state of Hessen. She also serves as a member of the board of directors of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom. Great to have you with us.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here.
Good morning. Dr. Priya Bondre-Beil is Director for Strategy and Policy at the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, the DFG. She was formerly head of international research training groups for the DFG, and she currently heads its European Science Policy section. Good morning, and thank you so much for being with us on the panel. You're on mute right now, but we'll unmute you shortly. Thank you so much. And Professor Catherine Sarah Barnard is also with us. She is Professor of European Union and Labour Law at Trinity College, Cambridge, where she also serves as Chief Tutor. Great to have you with us, Professor Barnard.
Lovely to be here.
And it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Orhan Shagriar. He's Professor of Philosophy and Cognitive Science and Vice President for International Affairs at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Shagriar. So let's take a quick look at those poll results before we go into our discussion. And our largest share of respondents says that EdTech and digital tools should be an absolute priority in reimagining educational cooperation. Second largest share, and that one, by the way, was 53%. Second largest share, 47% say enhanced mobility for students and researchers, in particular from non-European countries. And that was, as I said, 47%. And after that, we have 33% saying, respectively, that new partnerships and alliances between government institutions and public universities are key, and another 33% voting for access for vulnerable groups and regions. And then finally, new partnerships and alliances involving the private sector, also a fairly strong showing at 27%. So we're going to now unpack those results and get an overview from our panel. And I'd like to ask all of you to please give us your take on that response and also share your assessment of the seriousness of these dual disruptions that we've seen, both the pandemic and Brexit. Do they indeed, Madam Stark-Watzinger, prove a very serious setback for international educational cooperation?
They do that indeed. First of all, I think you put a hard task on our participants to choose between these topics because they all are important. But it was a clever choice of the participants. Why? I mean, most of us remember the book from Thomas Friedman in 2005 when he said, you know, the world is flat. You just enter a plane, you sleep, and you get out at the end of the world. And he expressed this, what we've seen over the last decade or the last 20 years, that globalization has taken place in an immense way. And this is good because we have huge technological, geopolitical issues to solve. And this is not done by nation states, by national governments. We need multilateralism. So, and this is why the choice was very clever, because it addressed the challenges that lie ahead of us, digitalization and other topics, climate change, but also that we need the mobility. Why do we need the mobility? Because these challenges need clever ideas. And we've seen that these complex issues in research can only be solved if you have free mobility, free large collaborations between universities, and that has experienced a backlash in the past. So we need this crisis to restart not only what we've done before, but to do more. Mobility, collaboration across borders for research and addressing the challenges.
Thank you very much. And we're going to, by the way, drill deeper on all of the options on that list shortly. So I really want to try to get an overview from all of you right now. I'll go next to Ms. Bondre-Bail, if I may. And please, again, your take on the audience response, also on the seriousness of the setbacks that you're seeing as a result of both disruptions, and perhaps also just a word on whether the DFG itself is doing things differently.
Thank you for your questions. In fact, my response would be that the challenge is also to look at the kinds of disruptions, because some effects of them are positive and some are negative. So to take the positive ones is that we saw that research systems can adapt, could adapt very easily to cooperate. Why is that so? Because, as was mentioned earlier, we have that kind of alliances. We have strong partnerships in research. They're maybe not always so visible, but we know we can rely on these strong systems. There are a couple of lessons learned in the negative side. This is that, as was equally mentioned, there's a high discontinuity, inequality also coming through. And I think that one would need to take a step back and look at the lessons learned. That's one point. The other point is that the important thing is that we have seen that stable research systems are required with a good functioning of funding, for instance. And we also saw that we need reliable science, because otherwise this would not happen. So coming to the DFG, your questions to DFG, yes, of course. We have completely changed our mode of work into digital communication. All our review processes, all conferences, everything is taking on like everywhere. It's sort of in the digital mode. But we also miss, of course, the human factor in that, in the sense that it's good if you already are part of a certain community and people know each other, rather than introducing yourself on the screen. So I think that this will be one of the most important lessons to be learned.
Thank you very much. I was actually going to ask you a follow-up question exactly about that, about the human factor, because in a way, these two first-runner answers, the digital tech and ed tech on the one hand, and mobility on the other, in a way, they're opposites, you could say, in the sense that digital tools can substitute for physical presence. How important would you say it is for scientists in the research area to actually meet together physically, whether at international conferences or through exchanges? I'm going to ask the same question in a moment to Professor Barnard, but I'd like to get it at two different levels, not only at the level of students, but also at the level of researchers.
I think it's a very important question, because you have a different speed also. It's not just the meeting, the sort of physical meeting, but in a research space, time is an essential factor also. And you cannot compensate this easily through digital experiences. As you can see in conferences, for instance, you don't have coffee breaks. This is a very important, it sounds banal, but it's very important, because that's the moment where people can speak informally, and the best ideas come out very often in such areas. So I think that in fact time, space, and let's say the spirit that is transmitted within a group meeting is of high importance.
Thank you very much. And as an event moderator, I could not agree more that coffee breaks are, in fact, a very crucial and valuable part of live conferencing. So let me go now to Professor Barnard. And if you would please, again, your response to the audience poll. But beyond that, I'd also like to ask you specifically about the impact of Brexit, because I was looking back, doing research for this discussion, and came upon that open letter that was signed by Stephen Hawking and I think 150 other fellows of the British Royal Society in the run-up to the Brexit referendum, in which they warned that Brexit would be, quote, a disaster for UK science and universities. What do you think? Are they being, or will they be proven right about that?
Well, thank you very much indeed for these excellent questions. Let's start with the Brexit one, and then we'll go on to COVID. As far as Brexit's concerned, today is actually a rather momentous day, because it's 5 years since the referendum took place. And so we have done quite a lot of thinking and reflecting on what we've learned over the last 5 years. As far as universities are concerned, one of the reasons for the great strength of British universities has been that they took full advantage of free movement of persons, free movement of young people, free movement of students, and free movement of postdocs, and we have benefited hugely from that. That has been turned off, because of course that was one of the great aims of Brexit, to stop free movement, and indeed that has occurred. At the moment, we're still benefiting from the talent of people who are already in the UK, and they should have applied for settled status. And the deadline for applying for settled status is next week on the 30th of June. So we still benefit from that young talent. But what we're not getting is the throughput of talent. And actually, what's replaced free movement is one of the most liberal, probably, immigration regimes in the world, for high-skilled, talented people. But the stumbling block is the cost. The visa fees are eye-wateringly high. I think we probably have the most expensive visa regime in the world. And in anticipation of you asking that question to me, I did some sums to try and work out how much it would cost to bring a family of 4 over to the UK for a 5-year working global talent visa. And it comes in at a cost for a big employer, somewhere in the region of £19,000, so what, 25,000 or so euros. I mean, it's an astonishing sum of money. Now, of course, if you're coming as a single person for a shorter period of time and to a university, it will cost somewhat less. But nevertheless, these visa fees are a huge barrier to mobility. So, I mean, I can talk at great length about Brexit if you wanted to, but you've told us to be short. So, in answer to your second question about the effects of COVID and the poll that you conducted with your audience, I do a lot of teaching. I've done, like most academics, a huge amount of teaching on Zoom, and all our lectures have been what are called asynchronous, which means that we've recorded them in advance. I've sat in my study here and recorded hours and hours of lectures, much to the joy of my family. And what's really striking is when we were allowed to do some in-person teaching with the students, just how much the students enjoyed it. And indeed, in the autumn term, we were teaching outside, and everyone was wrapped up to the nines, thick coats and thermal underwear and a lot. And still the students preferred to be sitting in the cold, being taught outside, than actually being taught online. It really was quite remarkable. And so despite the British weather, we have been doing some in-person teaching, and that's what they want. So the idea that everything can be done online, while it seems efficient and appealing, in fact, that's not what the students want.
Thank you very much for that. Let me go on now to Professor Chagrir. And the EU and Israel, of course, have a long history of educational and also research cooperation. Do you see that changing as a result of either or both of these disruptions, the pandemic and Brexit? And what are you and Hebrew University prioritizing for the future? Would you agree more or less with our audience's emphasis on digital and ed tech on the one hand and mobility on the other?
Yes, so thank you. So about the Brexit and the relationship with the EU, so we don't see much impact on, at least on us. I mean, at least on the side of the Brexit or the pandemic. This is probably because we are only an associate member of the EU and not a regular member. But when it comes to the impacts of the coronavirus, so let me say something first about the opportunities. So we see, at least in our institution, first a surge in the number of international collaborations, probably research collaborations, probably because people realize that they should collaborate more now when they face the pandemic. We also see an opportunities with all the digital platforms. And just let me mention one, and this is this model of virtual exchange. So many of our students, even in regular times, they cannot go abroad because of financial or cultural reasons. And now we offer them a platform in which they can take courses in other universities while staying in Jerusalem, and of course, vice versa. And this is something they couldn't do before. Having said that, I agree completely with what has been said before, that there is no replacement to face-to-face meetings, coffee breaks together, etc. And here again, we hope that next year we will start sending our students to the exchange programs, live, and we see here a huge increase in the number of applications from our students, and I think it's a good testimony that they really want to go and meet our other students in other cultures and stay there and not just do this on Zoom.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to pick up on that point with you, if I may, Mr. Watzinger. And, probably it's going to be preaching to the converted, given our likely audience here. Nonetheless, I would like to ask you to just briefly state from your perspective what you see as this overall societal benefits from exchange programs. And I'm talking now about physical exchange programs in which either students or researchers actually physically interact with the people and the place of a different country and culture.
This is a very important question. I mean, it's two sides of a coin, right? Having the innovation topic, but also having this cultural issue. And I can draw upon what the excellent points the panelists made. The human factor is so important, and the human factor can't be digitalized. Yes, we can learn to combine, we can take the learnings and come to a new level, not only physical, not only digital, but come to a new level. Why is it so important that we have this exchange? I think in Europe, we all feel it every day, how important it is to have the understanding of other cultures, other traditions, and just for the younger generation, to really feel Europe as their home, not their nation state, but Europe, being a European. This needs an understanding, and this is why it's important to study in another country, to interact with other cultures, coming together, losing the fear of globalization, understanding why is France following another tradition in economic policies compared to Germany, a centralized state versus a federal state. I mean, you can read it in books, but if you feel it, it gets much deeper and it helps to find new ways. So this is something we really have to put a lot of emphasis. And now I just talked about Europe, but of course this is also true for the rest of the world.
Thank you very much. And I have to say, perhaps at this juncture, that I am absolutely a product of that myself. I came here on a 3-month visa with the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, DAAD, and I've been here for 30 years.
Let me say something. I've been living in London for several years. I mean, that's still within Europe. And I moved there, and I realized how German I am, right? Because you have your, how do you do Christmas traditions and things like that. And then I moved back after 6.5 years, and I learned that I'm less German than I thought, because I brought so much with me. So I mean, you have to learn it by yourself to understand how it is, how other countries feel and work. So.
Thank you very much. Now let's dig a little bit deeper on Brexit, first of all. And I'd like to ask all of you, and I will just start here, if I may, again with you, Mr. Stark-Watzinger, to tell us how you think that we can and should deal with the departure of the UK from the Erasmus program. Are there ongoing discussions about good options for somehow replacing this or otherwise making up for what is definitely a loss?
Let me say first, we always interacted and we always made the point that the exchange when it comes to research and education should not be part of negotiation in a way that I mean, there was always this cherry-picking topic, right? But and in a way, it's understandable that if Great Britain does want to exit the EU as such, not Europe, but the EU, that of course you have to find certain rules. But with regard to research and education, it's important that we there are much more flexible. There has been now some sort of understanding and there has been agreement, but more bureaucracy, less exchange, it's getting more expensive. So we have to work on that because the UK for us is an important research place, right? Look at the tradition at the universities you have there. It was always top 3 country for German students to go. So we should take that as a basis now, what we have in place, but we should make progress and make it more easy, facilitate it more, and put more money in it. It's worth it.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Bunderbeil, do you have thoughts on that point as well? You're on mute, I believe.
Okay, now it works.
Thanks.
Excuse me, I couldn't hear your question.
Okay. Do you have thoughts as well on how the EU and the UK can work to replace or otherwise make up for the loss of the Erasmus program?
Well, the UK itself has set up a sort of unilateral Erasmus program, but this is, of course, by no means a replacement, or it's not even filling anything, because it's going to be extremely expensive for other students to come into Britain, as Professor Bernard was saying. So this is not the best of the solutions. It's going to be, since the UK is now associated to Horizon Europe, to the very large EU framework program for research, of course, this was one of the major fears, that this would not be negotiated. But it has been successful. There are so we have a good basis on that side. The other question is, because Europe is not made, or European research is not made in Brussels only, but the larger part and the largest part of it is through bilateral research, or through research that is not even funded officially, because the scientific communities between the UK and Germany are so large, and they have been working together for, I don't know, forever. So the responsibility here is to foster that kind of exchange, which is not necessarily it doesn't need additional programs or anything like that, but the essential thing is to be sure that these kinds of cooperations will be ongoing and will be fostered.
And do you see that happening? Who needs to drive that, and how?
It depends on the, let's say, the outreach of the UK, because we know that the UK has sort of is very much pushing a global presence. It's more the global power, so to speak, that the UK is looking for, but we know that the UK is a major part of Europe, in the cultural sense, in the scientific sense, in every sense. So it would be a good sign to get a little bit a clearer picture of how the UK is taking on its responsibility for the European research area in the future.
Then let's go straight over to Professor Barnard and ask her to say a little bit about what it looks like from the UK side, and perhaps a couple of follow-up questions here. That one, and then also you mentioned the enormous expense, and of course we're also seeing tuition rates go up for students who do still wish to go to the UK. They're going to be looking at significantly higher tuitions if they are coming from Europe. So whether there are any initiatives to alter that, because of course our poll survey showed concern about the ability to reach vulnerable groups, to reach those who are perhaps less privileged. And then my third follow-up, if we can keep all those points, all those baskets open at one time, would be for you to also perhaps just say a word or two about the same point that I raised with Ms. Stark-Watzinger, about the societal drawbacks or disadvantages that come from missed educational exchange opportunities.
Well, thank you. Taking those in turn, as far as Horizon is concerned, in principle, the UK has signed up to the Horizon Research Programme, but as far as I'm aware, the terms of the UK membership have not been finalised. And this is an area that the EU is using as some lever to persuade the UK that it needs to comply with its commitments under the Northern Ireland Protocol. So I think there is still some uncertainty on precisely the nature of, well, this is where politics is rather trumping the needs of the research agenda. So that's the first thing. Secondly, you ask about the question about fees for students studying at UK universities. Now, here the UK looks much more like the US model than the European model, although not as expensive, but nevertheless still pretty eye-watering. We have two levels of fees. We have home fees, which come in at about £9,000, and overseas fees that come in at about £17,000. If you're a home student, or I should say a student with settled or pre-settled status, so a European student who's already in the UK, you pay home fees and you get a student loan to cover that cost, and then you pay that back as and when you're working. For new students who want to come from Germany or elsewhere to study in the UK, a group of students which UK universities fight over because of the quality of the students, what we're seeing, and we're seeing this in my own university and particularly my own college, is scholarships are being set up to enable those students to come. So competitive scholarships, which they compete for on merit. But clearly that's costing the UK universities a lot of money to encourage those students to come. On your third question about the benefits of exchange programs, I think there are substantive benefits and cultural benefits. Substantive, of course, you learn a lot about another system. So my law students who go to France or Spain, Germany, are learning substantively about the law of a very important legal system. So really important to learn that. But of course, it's the other things that we've already heard about. It's about understanding the culture of the receiving country. And also allowing the students to develop personally. And one of the things that we do note with students who've gone on Erasmus up until now is that we see that they probably perform half a class to a class better when they come back from the Erasmus program, because they have matured both intellectually and personally. And that's why we're strongly supportive of those sorts of programs.
Thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. Let me go now to Professor Chagrir again, and I'd like to ask all of us, before we move on essentially to the second part of today's panel, I'd like to ask all of us to just drill a little bit deeper on some of those different options that we had on our list for potential means of revitalizing and reimagining educational cooperation, and ask you to talk about where you see particularly innovative opportunities going forward. And I'll just remind you, Professor, of what was on that list. As we know, EdTech and digital tools were one of the audience's main priorities, and I would be interested to hear your thoughts on where you see especially interesting and innovative alternatives in that area going forward, and what the benefits would be.
So, yes, so I think, as I said, I mean, there are, I think, really many opportunities in new teaching models that are based on digital platforms. If I understood correctly the question, so I mentioned the virtual exchange. I can also mention two other models. One is that, for instance, we established a joint virtual platform with the Free University of Berlin, in which we teach together courses online. There are two teachers, one from Berlin, one from Israel. The students are from both universities, and they study together in the same class. We will have 5 new classes like this next year. And I think, again, it's an opportunity for our students to learn about other cultures, other systems, to meet, in this case, online, other students, and hopefully they can meet at the end of the semester. Another, I think, very important platform is that few universities together, especially in small fields like, let's say, Egyptology, or for instance, or so students, there are not many, students and researchers in these fields, and then you can have a few universities joining together and having each university contributes 1 or 2 classes to a pool. So students, advanced students, can sit together from different universities in the same virtual class and study together, something they couldn't do before. And so, and there are also other models we can think about. So there are, I think, really many new opportunities here. Again, I think there is no replacement to physical presence and the personal connection, but we should, at least in my view, we should certainly take advantage of the new digital platform that we learned about during the Corona.
And may I just ask you also one follow-up about another of the options that was on that list in our first audience poll? You mentioned it as well in your first answer, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about it, namely outreach to vulnerable groups and or regions. What kind of programs do you have in place at the university for trying to do that?
You mean in general or in the context of virtual?
No, in general.
Yeah. So in general, I mean, we have a lot. I mean, it's one of our main goals to encourage students from underprivileged populations to come to study. I can mention only one, which is actually under our responsibility at the international office. So, for instance, 5 years ago, we had about 0 students from East Jerusalem, Arabs from East Jerusalem. 5 years ago, we established a preparatory class for 1 year. It is fully funded for, for graduates of Arab schools from East Jerusalem, and we started with 20 or 30. This year, we already have 500, which is about 10% of the, I think, graduates from the high school in East Jerusalem. And as a result, we also have about 8 to 10% of our first year students are now Arabs from East Jerusalem. So this is, I think, just one example of the huge efforts we do to bring students from, in this case, from East Jerusalem. We also are doing steps, I must say less successfully, to bring students from the ultra-Orthodox population of Jerusalem. They are less willing to come, but we are still hopeful.
Thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, I just took a look, and so far we're not getting a lot of questions flowing in. Please, we're very eager to hear from you. So do use the Q&A function on the live stream to send us your questions, and then we will pass them on to our speakers. Let me ask Ms. Stark-Watzinger to weigh in on both of those issues that we just discussed, which of course are linked. Digital access being a major driver of inequality in many societies, or lack of digital access. And I'd like you to say a word about Germany. We actually did a digital panel on Monday, so we've talked a little bit about it, and we did discuss there the fact that the pandemic revealed some very grave deficits, even here in Europe's most largest economy. So how do you see that going forward, particularly in the realm of education and educational exchange? And do you think it's sufficiently on the political radar? Parties love to talk about it, but do you see
Absolutely.
really convincing solutions out there?
I mean, you just said it. We talk a lot about it in Bundestag, about we need digitalization and the education system has been digitized. And we've heard already that in the university world, it has worked out quite well. But you know, to achieve, you know, to become a student at a university, you have to be able, you know, to go through this education system. And we talked about vulnerable groups. So we have to look what happens before we reach that level of education, what happens in primary education, what happens in kindergarten, what happens, you know, before you enter formal education. And there we have a huge lack in Germany. We've seen it in the crisis. Neither are the schools equipped. We do not have even the technical equipment in place. Neither nor are the teachers trained to do that. And if we don't do that right now, it takes 5 years for a teacher when he starts his studies and before he becomes a teacher. So what we don't do now will not happen in 5 years' time. Why is this happening? It's not the money. It's in the budget. It's not that there are not products out. It's bureaucracy, and it's probably the lack of the right spirit, because you have to be bold to try out something new. If you only look for the security factor, then you won't do it. For example, why didn't we, you know, make it happen in the crisis that within a few months every pupil got a digital tool to work from home? I mean, there are children who do not have the opportunity. The parents cannot pay for a second laptop or for a iPad or whatever you want to need. So, I mean, the money is there. And we have states, we have this federal level where you have the money from the state is given to the federal level, to the state, to the Bundesländer. And there are countries where you have to write 400 pages for an application to get money from the state to buy technical equipment. You have in my home state, Hessen, you have the schools needed to have a very high-speed internet, which is not the case. That was a precondition to get money out of the digital funds we have. So it is bureaucracy that is hindering us, and this is something we can overcome. This is not rocket science. It's something you really want to have to do. And this is what needs to be done within the next 2 years, because otherwise we lose, we lose so many pupils on our way there.
Thank you very much. Let me ask Ms. Bandre-Baal and also Ms. Barnard whether you would like to say anything in regard either to digital and edtech or in regard to access to vulnerable groups. We have talked about that a bit, particularly in regard to the UK, but perhaps you have something to add before we move on to our next topic. So just give me a sign if you'd like to say something. Ms. Bandre-Baal?
Yes, I would probably say something about the opportunities of digital communication, because it in certain circumstances, like for instance, we involve a lot of international reviewers in processing applications to the DFG, and if we can sort of include them, because they don't have to travel, and we sort of first of all, we travel less. That's one thing. So there are less flights, less pollution, etc., etc. That's one thing. And you can include more people. It's more inclusive in that sense. And you get more experts, maybe, because people don't have to, spend 4 days getting from A to B. So this is a good challenge, and this is opportunity. So I think that there is another challenge to it, to professionalize it, to make it more attractive, also to spend time and be alert, and because you need a different kind of environment. You need more introductory material. You need more of a setting. So it's not just the hardware that is the problem, but it's also the way how to set up the right methods to be efficient in that.
Indeed. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Professor Barnard?
Yeah, Thank you. I'd broadly agree with that. I mean, I think the world going forward will be hybrid, and we will be doing more things online because it's easier to accommodate in people's rather busy schedules. But I think we've got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What is unique about going to university is often for students is leaving home and developing their skills, being independent. And if they carry on living at home and doing everything online, you lose some of that softer skills that you get from being in a student community. And so I think universities have got to think long and hard before they say, well, let's carry on doing everything online because it's a whole lot easier and quicker and cheaper. Because I think the universities will then just be a sort of extension of school, which is not necessarily good for our young people going forward.
Can I add,
Please.
Can I add
Yep.
one thing? I would like to just one comment. Absolutely true, and it's also at least for the let's say the world of research, very often coincidences are important. Things that you cannot plan. So if you set up a digital conference with 3 people or 4 people, you won't have the opportunity to meet number 6 or 7. And this is something that is really important, to have that kind of unforeseen meetings, unforeseen ideas, which is really necessary for the advancement of ideas and projects.
Right.
Yes.
There's, in fact, a famous study of a building at MIT in the immediate post-war era. I think maybe it's Building 49, but I may have forgotten the number, where they sort of put everybody who didn't fit into their other disciplines. So it was a very eclectic mix of scientists who were in that building. And the conversations around the water cooler apparently turned into some of the most innovative designs and inventions around, including helping to make Boston the absolute center of the loudspeaker industry, just for starters. So a fascinating example of exactly what you're saying. I'd like to move on now to the question of partnerships in general and broaden this out beyond Brexit and the pandemic. Because, of course, Brexit is just one example of the way that resurgent nationalism and concerns about sovereignty and immigration can hinder educational cooperation. And if I look to my own original country of origin, the US, we saw a very significant decline in international student enrollment during the Trump years, essentially driven by forces of that type. So I'd like to ask all of you briefly, and you can just give me a sign if you would like to respond to the question, whether you are concerned that we could see this trend gain momentum in coming years as part of a general backlash against globalization, which, by the way, will be our topic in our last panel tomorrow, and how and you think we can and should respond to this. And I'll start here with you, if I may.
Yes, of course. I mean, let me split my answer into parts. First of all, if we talk about education, it's about having students, giving students the ability to study abroad, get more insights, and also the other part of the coin is that we have more innovation and bigger ideas, which was also addressed. Luckily, I think when it comes to the first point, students' mobility, I think now with the new US government in place, I think we will see a time change there. And I'm very optimistic that we will have a much greater exchange with the US again, which is still an important area for research and an economic area, which is important for Europe. Looking at other countries, looking at Eastern Europe, looking at China, looking at, Belarus and countries like that, looking at Turkey, it is it is becoming more and more difficult because these regimes are frightened because if you have pupils coming and to your country, they might plant ideas in the heads of the fellow students which are not welcome. freedom of speech, freedom of research, and much more like that. So this will be probably something we have to address within Europe, but also when it comes to these countries. And with regard to innovation, we see that productivity is going down, and this is because we have more complex issues to resolve. So we need a broader research areas, and when we build up new walls, then we will hinder that, and we will have less prosperity in countries that might desperately need it.
Professor Shugrier, can I ask for your take on that same issue?
Yes, I actually completely agree, and I just want to add that I think that there really is no way back from this trend of mobility and international students. I mean, I see it in our country. Students see it as important to go abroad as part of their studies in the Hebrew University, get some other perspectives, meet new students in other countries, and in general, they put a lot of pressure on the universities to establish more mobility programs. Because if we will not allow them to travel or to go or to meet international students on our campus, they will simply choose, other universities. They will not come to study with us. And I think that this pressure from the young generation plays a major role in future globalization. I don't see. So maybe the Trump administration, there was, it was maybe for several years, but in the long run, I don't see any setbacks in this context.
Let me go to Ms. van der Bijl and ask you, building essentially on what we talked about a moment ago about that culture of spontaneous and random exchange in something like Building 49, if that was the number at MIT. I recently attended or moderated a debate that was essentially about innovation cultures and comparative advantage in innovation. And the debate was Shenzhen versus Silicon Valley. And a point made by the person speaking on behalf of Silicon Valley was that openness will always trump closeness when it comes to driving innovation. Would you say that that is true? Because, of course, one of the arguments made by economic nationalists is that, no, we have to really keep the good jobs for our own people. We have to make sure that it's our society that profits from innovation. So what would be your response?
The response is quite clear, because if you don't allow for diversity, there is no innovation, and that's the main, one of the most important things, and it's also a question of what kind of research culture do you establish in a country where the country is either monolithically focusing on its own benefits, without taking into account that you need a broader approaches. And true innovation is always made up of several pieces of a puzzle. It's never a linear target to follow. So I'm very much in line with what you quoted.
Thank you. And I'll just go briefly to Professor Barnard for a take from the UK. Ms. Stark-Watzinger was pretty optimistic about the revitalization of US-European academic cooperation, but I think many in the US are concerned that we could see that Trumpist America First idea come back after midterm elections in the US, because, of course, there are many voices in the US that do take a very protectionist stance when it comes to jobs and economic benefits that flow from education. So I wonder how you see it in regard to the UK. Are you concerned about what resurgent nationalism there will mean going forward?
There's a deep tension in the UK, which has arisen post-Brexit. The government talks on the one hand about its global agenda. And so, as you know, the Erasmus programme has been replaced by the Turing programme. And the Turing programme enables students to go not just to European universities, but also to universities around the globe. And there is an additional premium which is given to those from disadvantaged backgrounds to encourage those to participate as well. So on the one hand, the government's talking about a global agenda, which I think does differ from the Trumpist agenda. And on the other hand, the government is talking a lot about levelling up. Now, it's not entirely clear what levelling up means, but it seems to be quite a useful bucket to put all sorts of disparate ideas into. But it's obviously focusing on what are known as the red wall seats, so seats which used to be held by Labour, the party from the left, and have now been taken by the Conservatives, the party on the right. Now, a lot of these people were Leave voters, so they wanted to leave the European Union, and for them, they are much keener on a Britain First agenda and helping the British students and British young people out first and foremost. And so there is a tension about how to square those rather conflicting narratives. But I think where everyone would agree is that, as with the US, there are areas of the United Kingdom which are remarkably disadvantaged. And education is obviously a very important way forward. And indeed, universities such as mine are under huge pressure, and rightly so, to give opportunities to those from these very disadvantaged backgrounds in order to try and level up, i.e. to ensure that they benefit from the opportunities that traditionally more middle-class students benefited from.
Thank you very much. Let us now take a look at essentially the second topic on today's agenda, and I mentioned it in our introduction. Much of the concern that drove the limitations on international student enrollment in the US during the Trump era were very much focused on researchers and students from China and concerns about their role in the United States. And I mentioned at the outset the dilemma that some Western universities are facing in working with the Chinese Confucius Institutes. So let's take a closer look at that aspect of the challenge going forward. And I'd like to pose another question to the audience in that context. And the question is this: does a liberal democratic government system constitute a condition sine qua non, a necessary condition for international educational cooperation? Let's see what the audience has to say on that. And while we're waiting for that result to come in, I will let Ms. Stark-Watzinger take a shot at the question.
I mean, this is a real dilemma we are facing here, because if you want to have open-mindedness in research at universities, freedom of thought there, with limits when it comes to human rights, but having free thoughts there and freedom of research. And then on the other hand, you face regimes that use research and education as part of a soft power plan. Then you really face a challenge how to address that. And I think if we fund research, it has to be really, really clear that there is no governmental influence. And what we've learned in the past few years, this is something we've learned from the government. We made some investigations there, asked questions. And it seems that these Confucius Institutes, they have a purpose. They not necessarily have only the purpose of cultural exchange, but also to promote a socialist system. And we've learned that some topics when it comes to human rights, democratic issues, cannot be addressed, like Tibet or Taiwan, the relationship to Taiwan. And this is something that with Western culture is not acceptable. So I think we need relationships with countries like China, Russia, because when we have research collaboration and exchange of students and researchers, what we can do is actually support these forces in these countries who share these fundamental values like human rights and free access to education and freedom as such. So we should not cut the ties, but we should not be naive, and we should not accept that China is using, this soft power plan to influence foreign researchers, foreign students, and actually influence the debate. We see that in research, we see that in elections, so we have to be very careful with that, and we have to openly address it.
And are there particular things that you would like to see done in regard to work with the Confucius Institutes, concrete measures you think need to be taken?
I mean, they are quite unique from the setup, right? China and Germany funding both countries funding them. I think we should not allow Hanban to foster its activities here. I think we should fund studies regarding China and the exchange, but not accept that it's funded by state money from China. And I think we should be more open to give a home base for critical researchers from these countries with regard to visas and giving them a home base here.
I'll just tell you the results of the poll and get a quick take from you before I go to the other panelists. So we asked, does a liberal democratic government system constitute a condition sine qua non for international educational cooperation? 70% said yes. Is there not an argument to be made here that if we're open to cooperation with non-democratic systems, perhaps some of those who participate in those programs take our democratic values with them when they go back home?
Absolutely, but then you have to be able to address these democratic values. And if this is hindered, if this is not possible, then this is not acceptable. I mean, universities are the place, the most important place for exchanging new ideas, exploring new ideas, and freedom of ideas. And if we do not have that, then we have a danger to freedom coming from places we don't see right now. I'm not saying we should not have interaction. We could even have, we have a lot of exchange when it comes to collaboration between German universities and Chinese universities. This is fine, but having certain states from the Chinese state-funded activities at universities here, I think this is not what we should pursue any longer.
So let me go to the other panelists and ask them how they see it. Ms. Bandrebail?
Well, I totally agree with the concept of having, for instance, scientific research necessarily uncoupled from a political agenda, because this is also what we see in many autocratic countries, that research is taken as a pawn maybe for political reasons, and this is I think it's not only a Western value, it's actually the essence of what is scientific curiosity, because it's built on freedom. It's built on the idea of academia. And I think that this is a very important thing to notice if we, and I agree that no ties should be cut, and I think that this is a highly important, it's a value in itself to sort of have this in mind. But on the other hand, I think there's a big notion now about science diplomacy, for instance. It's very important to know what kind of role the diplomats have. So is it the scientists, or is it the means that they have to have a safe kind of international cooperation?
May I just ask you, because the debate in the US was very much focused on scientific researchers who were present in the US, and accusations, of course, were made that they were essentially sending secrets back to China, and some of them were expelled from the US. Do you have any facts about the degree to which that is, in fact, a risk, whether that was largely supposition or whether there are numerous concrete cases of such abuses?
I'm not an expert in this, I must confess. I know that the European Commission is very much alert, and they have just I've just received that. It's a draft of a paper on foreign interference, and it's quite detailed. But I wouldn't know of concrete numbers.
Let me go over to Professor Barnett and ask for your take both on the question and the audience response, saying that a democratic system should be a sine qua non for educational cooperation. So your take on that response, and then also on the issue of educational cooperation with China, both vis-a-vis the Confucius Institutes, but then the larger cooperation as well.
I'm conscious that the students that come to us from these systems, of course, are the future of tomorrow, and so they're the ones who need to be exposed and have their views challenged, and also understand that if they're coming to the UK, the US, or Germany, that we have a different system of values, and we teach according to those values, and that gives them a chance to reflect on their own values and what they have learnt. I would be very sad to lose all students from systems which we don't count as democratic, because this, I think, would do a lot of harm to the students who are coming in, and also to our own students who need to meet and be exposed to people from a whole variety of backgrounds. But of course, it is immensely difficult, because we know that these students may well be under pressure from their own governments. And in respect of having students, I should say that Cambridge welcomes students from China, and indeed has funding programs for students coming in from China. And indeed, they're some of our very best students, so they also challenge our own students. So it is, of course, a deeply contested issue, and is just in the British press at the moment. But it's a path that we are treading delicately through.
May I just ask you, because in fact I have two children who also attended educational exchange programs in the UK and had a number of Chinese co-students in their classes. Are you seeing a difference in the attitudes of the Chinese students themselves, perhaps that they're not as open to some political ideas, or perhaps as open in discussing them as they might have been pre the Xi Jinping era?
I haven't got a big enough data set to be able to make those sorts of comparative observations, but what I would say is it is true that we often see the Chinese students sitting together and eating together and mixing less well than we might hope. Clearly, we encourage them to participate fully, but what we don't know is what pressure they're on coming from their home universities. And so I think this is certainly a problem, but it's one we're very alert to.
Thank you very much. And Professor Chagria, I'll come to you again with the same request for a response to the audience question and poll, and then your take on cooperation with non-democratic partners.
Yes, so I might belong to the 30% of the voters in respect that I think that generally speaking, if I take the first sentence that describes this session, you say that the science and education are topics close to the heart of liberalism, and of course I agree. And we are talking about, also being critical, pursuit of truth, being more transparent, etc. So I think that basically that when you collaborate, cooperate with universities around the world, also from countries that are less liberal and less democratic, I think that generally speaking, and I'm saying really generally speaking, you really have you really insert liberal and democratic values into those systems, because you meet with people, you talk to them, you influence them, and it's true, it's not always easy, but I think I completely agree with Professor Barnard, who said that I think that at least it makes them reflect on their own values. So so in this respect, I think that these collaborations actually is an important tool and instrument to transmit actually liberal and democratic values. I also agree that we have to be very careful, because today we see that some regimes, they abuse these collaborations and cooperations, and we have to be very careful and to really examine and re-examine those agreements and collaborations. I might just remark at the end that when it comes to the Chinese, and we also think about this, just two remarks. I think that there are about probably 300,000 to 400,000 Chinese students studying in US universities today. It's a huge number, and I think the number of cases that we saw of espionage and things like this are a handful, at least the one that we know about. So we also have to think about this proportion. And lastly, about the Confucius Center. So I know about these voices from other places. We have a Confucius Center with PKU. And it's both cultural and research center. And I must say that we are very pleased with the center. We don't see any attempts to confine the research and impose censorship. Of course, we will not ask them to support, conferences on maybe Tibet or Taiwan, but we hold these conferences. We have a very strong Department of Asian Studies. We have conferences in these areas, and we don't see any attempts. No one comes and tells us, no, don't do this. Don't do conferences, don't do research on Tibet or Taiwan. So this is at least our experience with our Confucius Institute.
Maybe just two sentences to make it pretty clear what I mean is we have to differentiate between having an exchange of students and researchers on the one hand, and on the other hand, providing a platform for political agitation. And I think this is a question we all have to address, and this is a learning process, because it just started now, and the borderline is probably very narrow and can be this way or that way. But if an institute, and I know that there are different views on the Confucius Institute, but if an institute is directly under the influence of the propaganda part of the Communist Party, then my alarm clicks goes on, because we really have to look carefully into that, because we should not be naive. This is differentiate. I mean, I would stress that we have to differentiate between regular exchange and providing platform for agitation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Ms. Bundrabile referred a moment ago to scientific diplomats, or the sort of dual role. But of course, what you're saying is that it has to be a truly diplomatic role and not a propagandist role in that duality. Let me come to one last question to all of you that goes back to the partnerships issue that we had in our first audience poll. And I'd like to ask all of you to talk briefly about what you see as the most important partnerships for your in educational cooperation going forward, if you're in an educational institution, for your institution going forward, and then beyond that also, or in addition to that, partnerships not only with China but also with countries such as Russia or Belarus, other non-democratic actors, whether you see potential to work with them. So I'll start perhaps with Ms. Bundrabile and ask you to just talk a little bit about what you think should be key partnerships going forward, also for the DFG.
It's not, the question is a bit complicated because of course we have partnerships, key partnerships, which are based on common values, and they have been established for many decades. By the way, also with Russia, also with China, and other countries. I think that what was referred to earlier this morning, the idea of multilateralism, is something which is extremely important, and because it gives a platform to also discuss, let's say, something like common standards. There is more to international cooperation than just certain partnerships. It's also the efforts to speak a common language, to speak about certain concepts, to have that kind of exchange. And it's quite difficult, but it's possible to have such a moderation. And one place that the DFG is also part of as a participant, and in fact our president is now chair of that large international platform, which is the Global Research Council. And there you have people, they're all heads of research funding organizations all over the world, and they meet there, and they actually, what they do is that they speak about, they don't talk about politics, but they speak about common concepts and common standards. And this is one way to do it. It's a little bit indirect, but it's quite effective.
Very, very interesting. Thank you. In fact, in our first discussion on Monday in regard to digitalization, we talked a lot about standard setting and the importance of a clear, also European voice in standard setting, and that cooperative framework through the sciences is such a key part of that. So thanks for that. Let me go now to Professor Barnard, please.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, of course, our principal collaborators will still be those who are closest to us and also share the language. So European nationals, particularly Germany and Scandinavia, the US and Commonwealth countries. But one thing I would like to say, which we haven't discussed so far, is that we are thinking quite a lot about how to help and encourage development of cooperation with African countries.
Yeah,
I think, of course, South Africa is the easiest in inverted commas because, of course, it is the most developed. But we now have at Trinity funding programs to encourage good students from Africa. And we are working hard to make sure that those funds are used not just for students coming from South Africa, but elsewhere. Because there are good universities across the African continent, and we ought to be encouraging those universities to send us some of their best people, and so that they can benefit from the multilateralism, the internationalism of British universities, and then they can go back and hopefully that becomes a virtuous circle.
Thank you very much. Professor Chagrir?
Yeah, so, so I would say I think that probably our closest partners are the European universities. We feel that we speak almost the same language, and then probably we have a lot of collaborations with North America. And then, of course, in the rest of the world, but I must say that I'm a bit embarrassed to say that we don't have enough collaborations in Africa, and this is something we really want to work on. And yeah, I think it's very important, both for also for us, for our students.
Thank you very much. Ms. Stark-Watziger.
Yeah, I really like the idea of common standards and speaking the same language, and I think research and education can play a prominent role in that internationally. When it comes to your precise question, let me say 3 points. First of all, as Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom, I mean, it is in our core aim to be present in countries where there is still need to foster human rights or actually to promote them. So we will always stay there as much as we can and try to do our work and get more and more people convinced and strong enough to stand up for the idea. When it comes to my hat I have in Deutsche Bundestag, I would say we should really put a lot of emphasis, especially on transforming countries that go through transformation, because there you have certain freedom, you have this, boundaries are broken up and you can achieve something, and we should be there present. I mean, we have a university, a good university in Frankfurt where I worked, has a collaboration in Vietnam, for example. So go to these countries, be present, help to develop the countries with research, and get a lot of people there interested in these freedom of research and the values there. And thirdly, when it comes to the really problematic countries, again, we should not cut our ties, but again, we should be very careful that we are not that we're not providing platforms for agitation.
What's the status of cooperative programs with Russia and or countries like Belarus and Germany?
Very difficult, and not at the level we should be, because it is not wanted on the other side, or even, the ties are so, the restrictions are so tight that it's very difficult to perform there.
Thank you. I have just a couple of audience questions I'd like to bring in. They pick up on points that we did discuss a little bit earlier on. The first one would go to Professor Barnard, and it is this. How can Germany and the EU support the UK in its quest to reactivate access to the Erasmus program, or I suppose something like it? It's particularly unfortunate that politicians are misusing this issue for horse trading on the Northern Ireland topic.
Thank you. I think that's a generous question. I would say that, of course, universities are desperate to return to the Erasmus program, but the government's argument is that the Erasmus program was asymmetrical, that far more students came into the UK than went out, and therefore for the UK universities this proved to be expensive. I think it's worth bearing in mind at the moment that this is a government that is preoccupied with an agenda based on globalization and probably anti-Europeanism at the moment, but globalization and also a determination to show its independence and its sovereignty. And I suspect that relations are going to be extremely tricky for the next 2 or 3 years and possibly longer. So I'm pessimistic that that much can be done at the moment. The Turing scheme, which is the UK's replacement for Erasmus, is only funded for 1 year, and of course is subject to much criticism because it is, as was said before, a unilateral scheme, i.e. it funds UK universities going abroad, but not foreign students coming to the UK. And that rather misses the point about the X in exchange, i.e. being bilateral. And so I think I would urge patience on the part of Germany and the EU while the UK works its way through this period of unilateralism.
Thank you very much for that very thoughtful answer. And let me go now to Ms. Stark-Watzinger with a last audience question, and it is this. According to many articles, China steals intellectual property and other secrets from industries, academia, and government. But what's not so well known is how China converts that technology into military capabilities. How can the West address this issue? Can there ever be a trusting partnership? And it's been a common thread through all of our discussions here at this international conference, Restart 21, to talk about how Europe and Germany find a path vis-a-vis China going forward. So perhaps your thoughts briefly on that.
It is really a very difficult question. First thing we have to do is we have to speak up as Europeans with one voice, and we haven't done that in the past, and we see that China is gaining more and more influence in some countries within Europe, and this is something that should be addressed. We have to be strong together as Europe, because I think China will not be impressed if we don't speak up for our topics, for our values, because they do it themselves. I think this is only fair enough. We've been naive in the past 20 years to think that China would change because of a trade between the two countries, but this hasn't happened. So, I mean, Chinese people are great, but we have to be very careful when it comes to cooperation where the state is involved. Because of course, we know that there is a long-term plan to become more prominent again, to play a bigger role in geopolitical issues. And this is these days not done, luckily, by weapons, but it is done via other issues, other ways. So we should stand up for our values, and we should do trade, but we should do it on the terms we also set, and not only accept the terms of China and countries like China. So we could be more bold in what we ask.
That's a great bridge to tomorrow's final session of our international conference, where we're going to be talking about restarting globalization and how we revitalize, for example, a fair international rules-based trading order. So I'll take your remarks right with me into that discussion tomorrow. But for now, let me say thank you very, very much to all of our panel, to Ms. Stark-Watzinger here with me in the studio, to Ms. Bandre-Beil, to Professor Barnard, and to Professor Chagrier for this very, very thought-provoking, wide-ranging discussion. It's really been a pleasure to speak with you today. Thanks as well to our organizers and to all of those who've worked behind the scenes to make our discussion possible. And many thanks to you, dear audience, for your attention and your contributions to our debate. We hope to see you tomorrow for that discussion on globalization. It will take place tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. Central European Time, right here in the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom and online. So hope to see you then. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.